How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 14th video on the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the second chapter of Bruce Fink's book, The Lacanian Subject, titled The Nature of Unconscious Thought, or How the Other Half Thinks. Last time, we looked at the role of the big other in language, and at the otherness of the body. Today, we're going to be going further into Lacan's understanding of language. This chapter is made up of 4 subchapters. Firstly, there's heads or tails, then randomness and memory, followed by the unconscious of symbols, and finally, but not at all leastly, knowledge without a subject. Fink begins with the claim that language functions, that it lives and breathes, independent from a human subject. In his own words,
speaking beings, far from simply using language as a tool, are also used by language. They are the playthings of language and are duped by language.
We aren't always in control of our own language. Sometimes, words that we don't want appear to us so powerfully that it's almost impossible not to speak or write them down. Such expressions originate from some other place than consciousness. Fink demonstrates this with this diagram. Here, there are 2 lines of discourse, the one conscious, the other unconscious. The upper line is a chain of spoken words and enunciation, whilst the bottom line represents the movement of unconscious thoughts. An example he gives of this is 2 people talking about a blister. One of them undergoes a Freudian slip, what's called parapraxis in psychoanalysis, and accidentally uses the word sister instead. Maybe this is because of something the other speaker said, which reminded the first of their sister. Or maybe it was rather that they were ruminating unconsciously about their sister from earlier on in the day, perhaps because they called her or dreamt of her. The unconscious thought processes proceed next to speaking, but for the most part independently from it, only sometimes overlapping. The question that appears before us now is how thinking functions in the unconscious, along with what processes occupy it. In Freud's seminal book, The Interpretation of Dreams, he offers 2 fundamental concepts in the unconscious, those of condensation and displacement. Lacan went further by linking the prior to metaphor and the latter to metonymy, something not built up by Fink at this point at the book. Describing the effect of analysis on the analysand when they discover these things about dreams and fantasy, Fink says,
virtually every analysand is astonished early on in the analytic process by the complexity of the process that gives rise to such unconscious products.
He takes the example of a coin toss, a quote-unquote real event as Fink calls it. The symbol plus represents heads, whilst the symbol minus represents tails. Thus, a random string of tosses can be recorded in a myriad of different ways, for example, like this. The reason Lacan calls this a chain, even though it seems to be clearly random, is because it can be broken down into pairs. For example, plus plus, plus minus, minus minus, and minus plus, as shown in this diagram. Now, although we started with something random, a pattern begins to rear its head. 1 refers to plus plus, 2 refers to plus minus, and minus plus, and 3 refers to minus minus. We can go further still if we look at the head-tail chain through the lens of overlapping numbers, as represented here. Going back to a simpler diagram, where the numbers are simply written below their pairs, we start to see rules popping out from the woodwork. In Fink's words,
it is already clear at this point that a category 1 set of tosses cannot be immediately followed in the lower line by a category 3 set, as the second throw in a category 1 is a plus.
Likewise, although category 2 can be connected to anything, a category 3 can't be followed by a 1, since it requires 2 minuses. We have thus found a structure that allows us to group seemingly random occurrences in a fashion that prohibits certain combinations. Fink terms this a symbolic matrix. He concludes this section by stating that, although this example is much more simple than Lacan's own, who developed his demonstration in sets of 3s and who placed on those sequences multiple symbolic matrices, it still 1 results in impossibilities, like 3 and 1 together, and 2 recalls within itself, remembering prior components and possessing a sort of primitive built-in memory function that notes these impossibilities. All in all, we can see the development of a sort of syntax, just like in language itself. This brings us to the next subchapter, titled simply Randomness and Memory. Here, Fink's main concern is just why Lacan ciphers things in this way. Lacan is essentially interested in the construction of a symbolic syntax, a set of rules or laws not necessarily grounded in any pre-existing reality. The goal here is not the deciphering itself, but rather this development of a matrix. Moving on now to the idea that the chain remembers, Fink quotes Lacan's écrit.
The remembering in question in the Freudian unconscious is not the same as that assumed to be involved in memory, insofar as this latter would be the property of a living thing.
There are two implications here. Firstly, there's the idea that grey matter and the nervous system as a whole is incapable of accounting for the eternal and indestructible nature of content in the unconscious. Secondly, instead of the individual themselves remembering, the signifying chain rather remembers for them. Ending this section, Fink says this.
The unconscious cannot forget, composed of letters working, as they do, in an autonomous, automatic way. It preserves in the present what has affected it in the past.
We now arrive at the penultimate subchapter, titled The Unconscious Assembles. He starts out by saying that this view of the unconscious wasn't simply a passing fancy for Lacan, but rather persisted long after he abandoned strict structuralism. In addition to this view of a symbolic chain, Fink adds that Lacan saw consciousness as grounded in trying to make sense of the world, with the unconscious having very little to do with meaning itself, in stark contrast to many other psychoanalysts who view the latter as being completely full of hidden signification. This is because the unconscious to Lacan is composed of quasi-mathematical strings of information, and, like Bertrand Russell says, the symbols that mathematicians work with don't mean anything of their own, making it pointless to try and force meaning upon them. Analysis therefore isn't concerned with meaning, but rather deciphers things like dreams in order to discover a truth of some kind. In Fink's words,
interpretation brings forth an irreducible signifier, irreducible signifying elements.
This signifier has no meaning, yet is traumatic to the analysand. To take a classic example found in the case of Freud's rat man, he identified himself with rats at a young age, seeing them as biting creatures treated cruelly by humans, he himself having bitten his nurse and being beaten by his father. Certain concepts became intertwined with the so-called rat complex through what Freud referred to as verbal bridges, the word rat becoming attached to syphilis, a disease sometimes spread via rats, money through a similar German word that means installments, and the rat man's father, the word for rat again being similar to that for gambler, the patient's father being a gambling addict. By itself, no meaning is involved. It's only due to literal relations between words that the system branches out. The signifier itself, at the core of the complex, is what subjugates the patient. Much like in the case of Einstein, which we talked about last episode, it's possible that the young rat man overheard his parents discussing gambling. At the time, he may not have truly understood the implications of what they were saying, yet the unconscious kept score, forming links with other scenes and phrases not meant for his eyes or ears. Through this process, the signifier isn't devoted to signifying. No, rather it exists only as a nonsensical substance, nonsensical as it relates to the patient at any rate. This brings us to the very last section of a chapter, knowledge without a subject. The unconscious is something unbeknownst to the person who holds it, with it constantly working in the background, recording, counting, and inscribing unknown knowledge. In turn, this unknown knowledge is locked in connection with a series of signifiers, free from meaning. All he does with this subchapter is to point out that this way of conceptualizing the unconscious seems to preclude the possibility of a subject, but nevertheless, Lacan speaks of one. This raises the question that underlies the entirety of this book. What exactly is the Lacanian subject? Now, this concludes the chapter on the nature of unconscious thought from Bruce Fink's book, The Lacanian Subject. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, we'll be looking at the creative function of the word, getting a first glance at Lacan's concept of the real. Until next time, bye!